Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Reapy. As a UC Santa Cruz Alumni Council member, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly speaker series, Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. For those who are new, our Slugs and Steins series engages a UC Santa Cruz faculty member in discussions with you, the local community of Silicon Valley, and our extended community online, with the goal of making us all Renaissance people. We wanted to feel like you're just at UC Santa Cruz sitting in class, but with drinks and no tests. David, another volunteer organizer, is with me tonight. We're both alumni and spend our days in entrepreneurial companies, Silicon Valley style. He'll be helping me with the Q&A, and you'll hear more from him at the end. First, I'd like to recognize that today is Indigenous Peoples Day. As President Biden wrote in his proclamation, for generations, federal policies systematically sought to assimilate and displace Native people and eradicate Native cultures. We recognize Indigenous peoples' resilience and strength, as well as the immeasurable positive impact that they have made on every aspect of American society. Before we get started, we'd like to take a poll to get to know our audience and where you are tuning in from this evening. Please take a moment to answer a few quick questions that will pop up on your screen. We'll share the results in a few minutes or a few seconds, and you should be able to see the results of our poll and who is in the virtual room with you. We'll just give it a little more time while I fill it out. Okay, we should be getting the results up. I see a lot of individuals, a lot of couples, some few people sharing. Most of the audience, it's pretty evenly split between the Santa Cruz County and Bay Area. A lot of California people, 20% outside of California and 5% outside the United States. That might be a new record. Nobody from outer space yet, I see. So today we raise a virtual Stein with Michael Chemers, Chair and Professor of Dramatic Literature in the Department of Performance, Play, and Design, and founding director of the UCSC Center for Monster Studies. In 2017, Professor Chemers authored The Monster Theory in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness, which was the first full-length monograph to deal with the history of monsters in performance. His Center for Monster Studies is an interdisciplinary research center that collects and disseminates monster scholarship from across the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Beyond UCSC, he's the co-convener of the Monster Studies Working Group of the American Society for Theater Research, and he hosts a podcast entitled The Show Where They Talk About Monsters, which I plan to tune into right away. If you have questions for our professor, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You don't need to wait until the last minute. You can type questions in at any time. If you see someone else's question that you like, you can upvote it and we'll ask that sooner. So please help us out as well. This talk is being recorded. In a few days, you'll be able to find it on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. We'll post the link in our social media channels and our follow-up email. Okay, does everyone have their Stein? Great, I've got your slug, Professor Chemers.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? All right.
Yes, hear you fine.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. That's for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here at Slugs and Steins. I'm very, very happy to be a part of this event and to be able to address the Slug alumni. It makes me very, very happy indeed. I'm really disappointed that nobody from outer space is tuning in today. I was really hoping on more of an alien response, but that's okay. So I want to talk today about, the title of my talk is Monsters in Our Closets, but I've changed the subtitle of the talk because I want to dig down into the Golem today. So that should be up now. You can see my PowerPoint presentation up there. So I'm calling it The Monster in Our Closet, the Golem, Monster Theory, and the Dramaturgy of Empathy. And I do encourage anyone to post a message in the chat and ask questions along the way. I won't stop until I get to the end of my talk, but then I'll be happy to come back and answer any of your questions as we go. So, Monster in Our Closet. As Michael pointed out, I am the author of this book, The Monster in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness, which, as you can see, has a golem on the cover, which makes me very happy. But today I want to talk about the dramaturgy of empathy. Now, when we talk about monsters and monsterization, the act of monsterization itself, I want to define that. It's not at its core very mysterious. Whenever there's a social crisis of some kind, different elements of society attempt to cope by locating the site of disturbance, identifying it as other, and then mapping that constructed fictional category of otherness onto real, actual bodies of marginalized people. We do this all the time, and the rate at which it occurs is accelerating due to the precarity in which we find ourselves today. Terrorism, global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and political chaos are all part of an environment where everything is connected and speeded up. It's no wonder that monsters lurk at the edge of all of our traumas. And so we find we no longer need to justify our scholarly interest in monsters, certainly not to our students who struggle constantly to envision a good future that includes them. No, the potential for the monster to play an important role in the envisioning of new and better worlds is one our students are hungry to learn about. So that's what I want to talk about today, is the potential for the monster to play an important role in the envisioning of new and better worlds. To focus on monsters in performance, as I do, is to engage in a historical practice that I'm calling the dramaturgy of empathy. This work cannot be cleanly yoked to a single theater historiographical school or critical theory. The emphasis in the study of the dramaturgy of empathy is to understand how theater history, when placed into particular interpretive contexts with social history and other arts, illuminates aspects of the human capacity for compassion, or lack thereof. And so these are some of the books that I consider to be very important in my scholarship: Theater Culture in America, 1825 to 1860 by Rosemary Bank, Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Cities of the Dead, Circumatlantic Performance by Joseph Roach. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to seek histories that allow my subjects to circulate in order that they reveal the many shapes and indirect relationships more than previous scholarship has acknowledged, and to investigate performance as a fundamental tool for human education, self-awareness, and empathic connection, one that does not reflect culture. See, this is where we often get into the arts, that we think that the arts reflect culture, but the theater, performing arts, embodies culture. It's a distinct difference. Now, for me, it's a lamentable fact that most academic studies of monsters devote their energies first to literary and then to cinematic achievements, giving short shrift, if any, to the theatrical history of monsters. And this leaves critical gaps in our understanding of how monsters influence the development of individual conscience and ideas about bodies configured as abnormal, and the public policies that victimize them. Tracking the startling transformations of monsters over time can provide resonant recognitions of how societies evolve and individuals act. This kind of investigation is hardly new. It was not even new in 1996, when the renowned medievalist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen inaugurated the field of monster theory with his book of the same name. Monster theory is not a wholly self-contained critical model. It's better described as a subsection of multiple fields of inquiry. Its central focus is to inquire into cultural practices that contribute to identity construction, recognizing that the appearance of monsters is particularly revelatory of the processes by which societies define and punish difference and deviance. What I've done that is perhaps new is to apply monster theory to the creation of histories of monsters in performance. And these reveal that our social progress is sometimes less progressive than we might hope. And as a species, we remain uncomfortably well prepared to call up ancient horrors to justify modern crimes, such as marginalization, persecution, and even atrocities, driving home Faulkner's famous line, "The past is never dead, it's not even the past." As anyone visiting the city of Charlotte in 2017 can affirm, the past is never dead, it's not even the past. However, these studies also reveal that some modern problems have ancient solutions, that we, like our forebears, have a choice, either to be victimized by the monsters in our heads or to employ them in an ongoing quest for self-discovery and a more harmonious and empathic society. I don't even have to go back to Charlottesville. There's more, even more recent instances of this sort of behavior. But by way of a relevant example, I want to go back to 1937 to an art exhibition called Der Ewige Jude, which means the eternal Jew, which opened in the library of Munich's German Museum, just one of the degenerate art exhibitions sponsored by the Nazi government of Germany in order to demonize Jews. The title of the exhibition refers to a very old story dating back at least to the 13th century of a Jewish man who, while witnessing Jesus carrying his cross, made a joke at the Savior's expense and is therefore forsaken by heaven and doomed to aimless, immortal wanderings of the earth. A monster if there ever was one. What you're looking at is a poster that was made of the exhibition, and I want you to look very carefully at the traits of this monster. Wearing an Eastern-style kaftan hat, the Jew has a long black beard, tremendous nose and ears, a protruding lower lip. He's dressed like a pauper, but he has a huge handful of gold, which occupies all his attention. His back is curved and bent, and he carries a map of Germany stamped with the hammer and sickle sign of the Bolshevik Party. It's all a rather cohesive attempt to appropriate the ancient monster as a modern threat of real Jews attempting to infiltrate and conquer Germany with the backing of Russian communists. This traveling exhibition incited anti-Jewish demonstrations and violence in every city in which it appeared. The anti-communist, anti-Russian element of the portrayal did not prevent the Nazi propaganda ministerium from producing another poster in 1943, this one for distribution in Russia. Above the Russian caption, Jews, a people of contagion, or Jew, a people of contagion, the eternal Jew sits on a mound of skulls, his attention absorbed by the bag of coins in his lap. His huge nose and ears, his protruding lower lip, and his long black beard mark him as the monster that he is, while a sun shaped like a Star of David rises over a landscape, presumably Russian, dominated by a burning city. After the fall of the Nazis, depictions of the eternal Jew character were considered explicitly anti-Semitic and avoided by mainstream artists for decades, although they still show up on the more anti-Semitic websites. What then can be made of this cartoon that appeared in the Vancouver Sun in 2003? This is a caricature of Osama bin Laden, the then leader of the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda. The kaftan is replaced with a turban, but the rest of the eternal Jew is there. The huge nose and ears, the long black beard, the protruding lower lip, the bent back, the pauper's clothes, the piles of treasure, American dollars in this case, and the territory he wishes to dominate. Embodied in these drawings, the eternal Jew returns, alleviating anxiety about the unfamiliar other by substituting an old familiar monster, already proven true by its repetition. Its power to alleviate anxiety now enhanced by its ability to lump all the enemies of right-thinking folk into one easily identifiable and therefore targetable group. I've chosen to talk today about the early 20th century rise in anti-Semitism, not only because of its topicality, because it's on the rise again, but also because of its strange relationship to the emergence of a particular monster, the Golem. During this period, during the early 20th century, Jewish migration from Eastern to Western Europe, often fleeing systemic oppression, was forcibly stopped, and Jews were confined to ghettos and refugee camps. This would spell disaster for millions in the coming decades. Racial and ethnic tensions flared up, anti-Semitic libels and conspiracy theories that had originated in the Middle Ages experienced a surge in popularity. In plays and early films, Jews became strongly and paradoxically associated with both the spread of communism and the dangers of rampant capitalism, with both standoffish iconoclasm and with toxic racial mixing, and with being both the victims of and creators of urban blight and corruption. Violence against Jews in Europe rose precipitously. In the midst of these troubled times, a very ancient, uncanny monster suddenly enjoyed an unexpected preeminence in Jewish culture that would, in various forms, dominate the last century of monsters and performance all over the world. This ancient monster is the Golem, drawn from a very old Jewish legend about a rabbi in Eastern Europe who, in anticipation of anti-Semitic violence against his community, creates a powerful living servant out of clay to aid the Jews. Gershom Scholem, one of the great rabbinical scholars of the 20th century, traces the legend to very ancient sources that describe the creation of Adam, also traditionally out of dead clay, the earliest being Psalm 139, lines 13 through 16, which I won't read for you now. Scholem observed that most of the many tales of the Golem and its misadventures share three characteristics in common. The Golem possesses great size and strength, the Golem possesses a power to see the future, and the Golem presents immense danger to its creator, as a single mistake in the magic will destroy the presumptive magician. The creator is, after all, just animated clay as well, and destabilizing the foundations of life can cause a sudden revocation of the creator's own special status as a living being. Sholem also notes that by the beginning of the 20th century, the story of the Golem was told in association with a real historical figure, the Czech rabbi Judah Loew, called the Maharal, who was one of the senior Jewish religious figures of the late 16th century. And by the way, he was a dedicated rationalist and ethicist who would never have raised a golem. He was very much against magic, but he gets associated with this story anyway. Golem stories featuring Rabbi Loew do not emerge in publication until 1904. The golem is a very old myth, maybe dating back to the 8th century, but these stories do not emerge with Rabbi Loew until 1904. The golem's main function in these stories is to protect the Jewish community from anti-Semitic violence. In some popular versions of the tale, Loew becomes forced to deactivate the golem when it uses its immense strength to commit violence and mayhem among the Jews after mistakenly being left active during the Sabbath. Many popular versions end with a confirmation that the unliving remains of the golem are stored in the attic of a Prague synagogue, implicitly available the next time Jews are faced with an existential threat. Uncannily, the golem is an anxiety-relieving monster that fulfills the fantasy that persecuted Jews might defend themselves. And this monster's popularity rapidly expanded beyond Jewish communities. Paul Wegener, former student of and trooper with the renowned Jewish German theater actor Max Reinhardt, became fascinated with the Golem legend and made 3 films on the subject. The third was this one. This is a still from this one, The Golem, How He Came into the World, and was released in 1920 to become an instant classic, to this day considered a landmark of German expressionist cinema. Although Wegener's film employs certain stereotypes about urban Jews, lascivious, scheming, impoverished, and sorcerous, condemning it as a document of anti-Semitism would be inaccurate. Nevertheless, it seems difficult to overestimate the role that rising anti-Semitism in Europe would play in cementing the film's initial popularity. The Golem had been translated from an obscure monster of Yiddish folklore into an instantly recognizable feature of popular culture that would inspire generations of writers. The effect of the Golem on Jewish theater in particular would be immediate and long-lasting. Now, under the Russian Tsar, theater in Yiddish or Hebrew was prohibited. After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1905, the Soviet government fostered a vibrant tradition of ethnically diverse theater that would include the professionalization in 1917 of the Habima, a Moscow-based Hebrew language theater company led by Nahum Zamach under the supervision of Konstantin Stanislavski and later of his pupil Evgeny Vakhtangov, which would collaborate with such eminent artists as Veslavod Meyerhold and Marc Chagall. Over the following 10 years, Habima would become celebrated around the world, particularly for its production of 3 plays, all of which featured monsters. The Dybbuk by Solomon Ansky, a ghost story, The Eternal Jew by David Pinsky, and The Golem, written by H. Leivik, the pseudonym of Leivik Halper in 1920. The Golem premiered in 1925 and was directed by Boris Ilyich Vershilov, featuring actors Baruch Chemerinsky as the Maharal and Aaron Meskin as the Golem. Here's a photo of Chemerinsky in the role, and I just wanted to point him out because Chemerinsky is my family name, and we hail from the same region as Baruch Chemerinsky did. But despite what I see as a strong family resemblance, I'm indebted to some researchers that I know at Tel Aviv University for helping me to discover that Baruch and I are not, alas, related. I'm really disappointed. But in any event, the play unmistakably uses the Golem's legend and Wegener's film as source material, but profoundly expands the scope of the drama to include some powerful ruminations on human ethics and subjectivity. In the first scene, the Maharal uses his vast Kabbalistic knowledge to prepare an unliving servant out of river clay. Things start to go wrong immediately. The night is filled with strange presences, including the spirit of the not yet animated Golem that appears to the rabbi as a shadowy figure and begs not to be created. He says, "Create me not. You see the stars go out, each one, so will the light go out in every eye that looks on me, and where my foot will tread, a blight will grow upon that place, and what my hand will touch, to dust and ashes it will crumble. Do not exchange my darkness and my stillness for the tumult of the streets and for the noise of men. The whole night through you kneaded me with coldness, and with cruelty you shaped me. How good it was to be mere clay, to lie lifeless and calm among the sands and stones of earth between eternities. It's very beautiful writing. This anxiety about being created is certainly not what the rabbi was expecting, but trusting in his faith, he dispels the figure and finishes creating the monster. Before departing, the figure crosses himself and prays to Christ, which is an unexpected gesture that will become increasingly meaningful as the play goes on. Once created, the Golem's relationship with the Jewish community of Prague is equally uneasy. Compelled to obey the Maharal, the Golem is tormented by supernatural visions of the coming pogrom, as well as by its status as a thing between two worlds. It is enslaved. It's not a folksy automaton. It rails vehemently against the cruelty and injustice of its existence as a prisoner to the will of the Maharal. This tension is exacerbated when the Golem meets and is sexually attracted to Devorale, the Maharal's daughter. The Jewish community is disturbed by the Golem's strangeness and mock and abuse it. Forbidden by the Maharal's command from replying or doing violence to its persecutors, the Golem bears the degradation as best it can, taking little solace from the Maharal's exhortations that the Golem's purpose is much grander. It will be called upon to defend the lives of the very people who treat it so cruelly. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, fundamental to the spiritual ethics of Judaism is a concept that Ashkenazic Jews call menschlichkeit, which might be translated as humanity in the sense of compassion or empathy. The root of the word mensch is not gendered. I always thought it was gendered. I always thought it referred to a male person, but mensch is not gendered, although it is commonly used by modern Yiddish speakers to invoke responsible masculinity. Menschlichkeit is a conscious decision to act righteously and honorably and to avoid causing unnecessary harm to any living thing, even and especially when one's enemies act unrighteously and violently. This compassionate aversion to violence is brought into a deeply nuanced engagement in this play. The Menschlichkeit of the Jewish community of Prague is what frustrates the evil priest Thaddeus to the point of violent acts he himself abhors, but feels bound to enact. It is what torments his conscience with nightmares. As for the rabbi, forbidden by his own Menschlichkeit from taking direct action against this violence, he has created what he thinks is a soulless monster to do grim tasks on his behalf and shield his own soul from evil, or so he thinks. But the Golem's existence as a proxy for necessary violence comes at an emotional cost to itself. It says, I spurn myself as I would spurn a worm. The Golem's capacity for self-reflection and self-loathing gives this play its emotional depth and theological complexity, and renders the Golem somewhat more compelling than a mindless automaton or simple-minded brute, and interestingly, associates him more strongly with the creature of Mary Shelley's 1819 novel Frankenstein, although it must be said, not with the wildly popular dramatic adaptations that dominated Europe between 1820 and 1920. The Maharal bears some interesting similarities to stage adaptations of Victor Frankenstein. On a journey into a cave of nightmares, the Golem enters a magical circle where he's joined by the Messiah and a third figure called the Man with the Cross. The presence of the Christ figure in the sacred Trinity in this moment of relative peace in the play advances our engagement with Menschlichkeit by linking this Jewish notion to a Christian ethos of universal compassion and redemption. Levick thereby focuses the audience's attention on the impossible paradox the Golem embodies. The Golem cannot be awake and sentient without also yearning for redemption and a purpose greater than mere violence, and he cannot avoid violence if he has to play his role as a Golem. After defeating the ghetto's persecutors, the Golem is further subjected to torments from the people it has just saved, and it turns its rage on the Jews of Prague, killing 2 of them. The Maharal experiences the profound anagnoresis that forms the core of the play's message, that he cannot dodge the requirements of his own ethics by doing violence by proxy. He laments the unfairness of this stricture. He says, on my head falls the blood, on my head. He came to save, and yet he shed our blood. Are we thus punished for our joy, O Lord? Are we chastised because we wish to save ourselves? I cannot help but hear in these lines an echo of those spoken a century earlier by Frankenstein in an 1826 adaptation of Shelley's novel, a play entitled The Man and the Monster, where Frankenstein says, I am the father of 1,000 murders. Oh, presumption, and this is thy punishment? But Frankenstein's transgression was one of pride, while the Maharal saw his actions in the context of an existential threat to his people. If the Jews of Prague are forbidden from God from defending themselves, how will they survive at all? Well, the play was wildly well received in Moscow. The censors from the Commissariat of Nationality Affairs, to which the ethnic theaters reported, redacted only the scene in the cave for fostering superstition. During one performance, when one of the characters cries out, "Who will save us?" voices from the audience responded, we will," meaning the communists, and several members spontaneously stood and sang the Internationale, according to eyewitnesses. The Golem ran for 340 performances in its first production and gained worldwide attention. But the Commissariat subsequently waged a campaign against Habima that was undoubtedly advanced by the death of their director and champion, Vakhtangov. Russian audiences were increasingly unresponsive. Anti-Semitism was on the rise in Russia. Permitted to tour in Europe, Habima was attacked as a propaganda tool for the Soviets or for Zionism, particularly in Poland, where anti-Semitism was enshrined in public policy. In this, Habima came to resemble a golem. Created to protect Jewish culture from within Bolshevism, it becomes itself understood as Bolshevism or simply Jewishness, out of control and a threat to the good people of Europe. In 1928, get this, Habima, the theater company, travels to New York, where they were immensely disappointed to find that audiences in what they called the land of milk and honey were accustomed to a less sophisticated, highly commercialized theater. Indeed, they remember that the production of the Golem had to close early when their financial backer abandoned them, having left a message that asserted he would gladly finance us to his last cent if we would only give our plays happy endings. Financially strapped and able to read the writing on the walls, the troupe jumped at an offer from the future president of Israel. Oh, this is some set design for the monsters in the Golem. I forgot to show you this. The troupe jumped at an offer from the future president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, who actually is my relative, to defect and become a Palestinian national Hebrew theater. The Golem was their debut, and on April 1st, 1928, it was sold out. The Jews of Palestine saw the Habima as heroic preservers of Jewish culture in an anti-Semitic Europe, but the critics were less generous. A reviewer for Haaretz wrote, "The Golem has rather cheap moments, which probably cause a great deal of enthusiasm among Jews in the diaspora and among the Gentiles, but Palestine does not like it. We speak of the excessive exploitation of the synagogue and religion in general. Neither will Palestine accept all that ghost business. We here have conquered many ghosts, or at least we make efforts to conquer them." So what had happened is that Habima now is fully a golem. It's rejected by the very community it had struggled so hard to rescue and represent. The monsters of the Golem were not only too Jewish and too Zionist for the Soviet censors, but they were also apparently too Jewish for the theater critics of Israel itself. But nevertheless, Habima remained popular in Palestine for decades and would revive the Golem in 1948 to critical acclaim. The New York Times reviewer, untroubled by his inability to understand Hebrew, described the dramatic rightness of the performance. What accounts for this different reception? Undoubtedly, news of the Holocaust, during which 11 million people, including 6 million European Jews, were systematically exterminated by Nazis between 1941 and 1945. The representation of Jews as an impoverished, iconoclastic, monstrous minority seeking to drain Europe's resources was quickly replaced in US theaters and film by one of Jews as a people unfairly persecuted since ancient times. The Golem, on the other hand, whose theatrical similarity to Frankenstein's creature had not been lost on other writers, rapidly adapted itself to embody anxieties about rapidly emerging technologies. The Czech playwright and humanist Karl Chapek could hardly have been ignorant of Prague's Jewish monster when he wrote his Marxist sci-fi play RUR, which premiered January of 1920 at the National Theatre of Prague, and from whence arises our term robot. In Chapek's play, short-sighted capitalists mass-produce artificial humans that run amok. Owing, no doubt, to the prevalence of technological anxiety as the computer age roared to life, Chapek's rebellious robot became an icon of science fiction plays, stories, novels, films, and comics, sometimes even returning in its original shape as a golem. But in 2002, in the aftermath of 9/11, the question of what is proper behavior in a world filled with violence and irrational hatred inspired a revival of Leivick's play in April of 2002 at the Manhattan Theater Ensemble, adapted by artistic director David Fishelson and starring Robert Prosky as Rabbi Levy and Joseph McKenna as his monster. Fischelson had determined to adapt the play in response to the rise in violence and civil strife associated with the Palestinian Intifada, which had rehashed some anti-Semitic canards as partial justification of violent political action against Israel. But in the context of a New York still reeling from the devastating terrorist attacks on that city the previous September, Fischelson writes, excuse me, Fischelson writes, a theatergoer's instinct might be to draw an analogy to recent Jewish history. In the wake of the Holocaust, Jews of the world armed themselves by creating a state of Israel, a Golem, to stay further genocide. But now they, like the Jews of Prague, find themselves caught in a cycle of violence that appears to have no end. The Golem is not, in this light, a denial of the necessity of resorting to violence. It is the lament of its necessity on earth. I find that morally ambivalent, but that ambivalence reflects that of Leivik, who wrote in a very different context and a very different time on the difficulty of finding an ethical middle ground between an idealistic pacifism on the one hand and an indulgence in vengeful, if ostensibly self-defensive violence. But for Leivik, it was not merely a question of lamenting necessary violence. It is rather his keen awareness of the detrimental effect of unrighteous behavior on the individual who commits those acts. The Golem, as a theatrical performance, embodies in real time and space this difficult dialectic and compromised moral position that has become, if anything, even more difficult to sort out in the context of this horribly violent new century. Alicia Solomon, who reviewed Fischelson's production in the New York Times, observes, if the play seems especially vital now, it is not only because some Jews continue to yearn for messianic redemption. It's also because the current generation has a different relationship with the idea of Jewish power than their grandparents, and thus the ability to consider the play's challenging themes anew. A century ago, the fantasy of a brawny and indestructible protector provided a compelling answer to Jewish vulnerability, even beyond the realm of the theater. Taking the logic further, one confronts the most troubling question that some Israelis and American Jews are beginning to raise. Has the militarily mighty Jewish state become a golem for the 21st century, promising protection, but leading to peril? Solomon's critique would probably have both pleased and dismayed the deeply ethical but deeply anxious Leivik, who brought a Christ figure into conversation with his Golem to expand his critique of hatred beyond a critique of anti-Semitism and into a more universal lesson in which compassion is held as a sine qua non of civilized human interaction. Violence may be necessary to survive in a violent world, but the violation of one's menschlichkeit renders one less than human, unfeeling, like a golem, neither fully alive nor fully dead. Leivik's Golem provides little practical advice in a world where racist violence is increasingly normalized, but it remains an eloquent reminder that the struggle for a better world must be as internal as it is political. That's the end of my remarks. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor. So as Mike mentioned in the beginning, please enter your questions down below, and they'll be sent to Mike and myself, who will read them up in turn. So Kristen asks, I'm interested in how stories of the Golem may have influenced Mary Shelley.
That is a very interesting question, and the answer is, I don't know, but that is not an answer of ignorance, that's an answer of research. I've done a lot of research into Mary Shelley. I cannot find her ever mentioning the Golem, but it's certainly possible that she would have heard those stories, especially if she was traveling around Europe. It's possible. It is certainly the case that the later versions of the Golem story, the ones that were written in the early 1900s, were heavily influenced by Frankenstein. That there's no question about that at all, because they use the same language and the same kind of actions. So I would say that although the Golem story is older than Mary Shelley, it's actually the modern Golem story is more influenced by Frankenstein than the other way around. That's a great question. Thank you, Kristen.
Let me pull a question from Julianne. What do you think the modern Golem would look like and act, given that anti-Semitism is on the rise?
Well, I don't have to wonder about that, Julianne. Thanks for asking your question. The most recent impression of the Golem that I've seen is in the movie, the Avengers movie, Age of Ultron. There's no question at all that Ultron is a Golem. And he represents this attempt to, as Tony Stark says in the movie, to put armor around the world, right? But the problem is that that the Golem is unfeeling, caught between life and death, and also has a lot of daddy issues, which these Golems also have, and which the Frankenstein's monster also has. So there's a lot of cross-pollination to be said there. But I think it is true that anti-Semitism is on the rise again. That is a fact, and that is one of the things that compels me to do this kind of research and to share it with you. That said, the lesson of the story of the Golem is that we must never take on the weapons of our oppressors, as justified as it might seem. We are exhorted by our Menschlichkeit to deliver compassion where we are hit with violence, and to deliver understanding and reason when we're met with madness and unreason. That's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do, but it's the right thing to do.
So we have a question from Kirk on regarding the Lord of the Rings and Golem in that connection. What was derived from what? Did that have a relationship by Tolkien to the Golem that we've been referring to?
Now, in this case, thank you so much. Sorry, what was the name of the asker?
Kirk.
Kirk. Thank you, Kirk, for your question. On this question, I think I'm on firmer ground. Tolkien, as far as I know, doesn't mention the Golem in his own work, but it seems ridiculous to assume that somebody with his breadth of knowledge about mythology and folklore would not have heard the Golem stories. I mean, that would be crazy. He must have seen the Golem, how he came into the world, and the other movies by Wegener, maybe. They were very popular. So considering that in ancient Hebrew, Golem means a lump of dead, like a dead lump, right? So you'd refer to somebody like an oaf, you Golem, you oaf, So our character Golem, who I love dearly as a big Lord of the Rings fan, a big Hobbit fan in general, I love this character, but he is associated with unliving things, with the clay, with the darkness, with stone, and he's become sort of stone colored. And so I think that, even though the cosmetically, the reason he's called Golem is because he has a problem with his throat and he keeps going, Golem, Golem, Golem. Nevertheless, I think that there's a direct connection to be made there between Tolkien and the Golem. Yes. Thanks, Kirk.
Oh, question from Riva. How does the relationship between medical intentions and ethics intersect with the idea of a liminal life-death body? That is, when does the Golem as expression of medical hubris begin?
Wow. That is, Riva, thank you for that question. I would like you to go a little further if I can. Could I ask you to expand a little bit further on that question? I think it's a wonderful question. But this is an excuse for me to think a little bit more about it and stall for time.
Maybe we'll take a second question from Riva then. Why does the Wegener Golem display a 5-point rather than a 6-point star?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, Riva. That's a much simpler question. I don't know why he displays a 5-point star. I think it's a pentacle, so it's an alchemical symbol, and certainly would have been part of the vocabulary of magical things that Wegener would have been exposed to. So I think that that's probably just it's as simple as that. It's just a pentacle, and it's just a different kind of magical item. I don't want to avoid that other question from Riva, though. Could you read it again, Michael?
Certainly. How early does the relationship between medical intentions and ethics intersect with the idea of the liminal life-death body? That is, when does the golem as expression of medical hubris begin?
Wow, that is a very powerful question. I think that unless I'm very much mistaken, the best piece of writing on this particular subject is written by Riva, and it's called Golem Girl by Riva Lair. Please check it out, everybody. It is an absolutely wonderful sort of memoir autobiography of a great artist and a colossal human being who I'm very honored is here today. Assuming that that's the Riva we're talking about.
It is. Oh, actually, we did have. There's a follow-up.
Okay.
I don't know when the connection between magical medicine and making a body begins. If that helps.
Oh, I see. I think it's interesting to think about the notion that the golem represents some kind of perfect body, right? A body that is beyond disease, beyond harm. It's created in its creator's image, like Adam. And so there's a sense that there's a perfection of the golem's body. But in the play by Leivik, he certainly looks strange to the other Jews who live with him, and he's persecuted and attacked by them because he looks different. Very similar, I think, to the way that they would persecute somebody who was profoundly disabled, right? So I think this notion of the golem as you said, as medical hubris. I think there's the concept of the golem as existing between life and death, as including both aspects of live things and dead things. I think that maps very powerfully onto discourses of disability and how disability is represented in modern culture. And I could go on and talk about that a lot more, but I think I'll stop there and get another question.
So Lisa asks, how does gender, or lack thereof, influence golems in theater? And are there any examples of golems in theater being portrayed as female or non-binary?
That is an absolutely fascinating question, Elisa. Thank you so much. The golem in all of the stories and all of the versions that I have read, the golem is either non-gendered, not non-binary, but non-gendered at all, just an object, or it's gendered male. And it's important in the 1920s versions that he has a gender, that it has a gender, because it is sexually attracted to the Maharal's daughter, Devorale, in one of the oh, thank you. Thank you, Mike. So the golem has a sexuality in the 1920s. I don't think the golem has a sexuality in the earlier versions. He's just sort of an automaton. It's just sort of an automaton. Now, interestingly enough, there was a Simpsons episode, The Simpsons, Halloween episode where they raised the golem, and it was Wegener's golem that they raised. And they make a bride for this golem so that he can be happily married. And it's played by Fran Drescher. It's pretty funny. But they make a female golem out of Play-Doh. So that's the only place I've ever seen a female golem appear. So that's a really good question, Lisa. Thanks so much for that.
Sorry, muted. Question for Maggie. What are your favorite contemporary golem-related works in TV, movies, books, etc.?
Oh, thanks. One of the things, Maggie, that I really like is there's a series of books by Helene Wecker called The Golem and the Djinn. And they were, let me look up really quickly when they were written, but Helene Wecker is a wonderful author. And let's see, The Golem and the Djinn came out in 2013. and a sequel, The Hidden Palace, was published this year in June. It's sort of a historical fiction rather than a fairy tale. It's historical fiction that has mystical sci-fi elements in it, and it's really, really wonderful. The Golem and the Jinn, or the Genie, the Golem and the Genie. So I would definitely recommend that. I like Ultron. We talked about Ultron before. I like the image that he represents. There's a very interesting dialogue about Darth Vader's relationship to being a golem. Some people say that they can read in Darth Vader's chest plate, where there's a digital readout. If you turn it upside down at a certain time, you'll actually see a gimel and a mem and a lamed, or a gimel, a lamed, and a mem for golem in Hebrew. But I haven't ever seen that. I think that's wishful thinking. But the fact is that nowadays you can't really tell a Frankenstein story without telling a Golem story, because of the aspect of the fear of new technology, right? That's a huge fear that the Golem represents, that also comes out in Frankenstein. So the two traditions have really merged over the past 100 years.
Stephanie, a long-standing faithful member of our community and also a past panelist, thanks you so much for the talk and wants to ask you, Dr. Chambers, to speak about the work on the Golem in relation to other projects being undertaken at the Center for Monster Studies. So Golem requires a particular attention to the movement of narratives in the diaspora over time, as well as the genre of performance. What other interdisciplinary lenses are in play among the center's projects?
Thank you so much, Stephanie. What a wonderful question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about the center. The Center for Monster Studies was founded just this past year, after we had a very successful sort of mini conference on Frankenstein in 2019 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the production of the novel, that also came with a panel that we did on how Frankenstein has impacted narratives of bioethics and scientific ethics. And that was a panel that I did with Jenny Reardon from sociology, David Hausler, who's the director of the Genome Project here at UCSC, George Blumenthal, who's a professor of astrophysics and former chancellor of UCSC, and Nandini Bhattacharya, who's a professor of mathematics. And I, arts researcher guy, me, was up there on the stage with these incredibly eminent scientists. And we had a really vibrant and wonderful discussion about the role that Frankenstein as a story has played in the ongoing discourse of scientific ethics. And it was absolutely fascinating. And we actually wrote it up and got it published in a journal called the Journal of Science and Engineering Ethics. It was just published this month. I think it was published in October. So that's very exciting. That's one of our outputs. You can also go onto our website at www.monsterstudies.ucsc.edu. And there's a bunch of resources there that kind of tell you what we're up to. If you go to monsterstudies.ucsc.edu/media-appearances, you can see a curated list of, right now it's just me going on different podcasts and talking about different monsters. But I talk about werewolves, I talk about witches and golems and vampires. As a matter of fact, I just finished, just before we started this show, I finished a podcast for the Vox Popcast people on the various permutations of Dracula. So for me, golems are a dear, wonderful, sweet interest, but we actually, any kind of monster is available to us at the Center for Monster Studies. And we are also, thank you so much for putting that up. We're also going to run a new Festival of Monsters in May 20th through 22nd, right here at UCSC. We're going to do a Festival of Monsters. And part of the appeal of that is going to be, we're going to be doing local Monterey Bay area monsters that go back for hundreds of years. So that should be really fun. There's some really interesting monsters. Steinbeck, nobody knows this about Steinbeck, but he was very interested in monsters and he wrote about them quite a bit. And we're going to have a writing contest for horror writers among the students. And it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have panelists. We're going to have people from all over the world are going to be coming in to talk about their work with monsters, and we're going to have a really good time. So keep your eyes open for that. May 20th through the 22nd, right here at UCSC.
Thanks for that, Professor. I think we'll try to get word of that out to the community through our social media channels when that starts up. I'm sure our audience would love it. We did have. Let's see, we had a question from Dylan asking about your podcast. I just want to note that we had an answer from that from actually Professor Kevin Karplus, who I took a class from many years ago. So thank you, Kevin. So I posted that into the chat box. There's a link to monsterstudies.ucsc.edu /media appearances. So how do we find your podcast? If that's not
so if you go to media-appearances on the website, you will find a lot of podcasts with me on them, but they're none of them are produced by UCSC. They're all produced by various other organizations. However, due to popular demand, I think I can say that, 5 or 6 people wanted it. We put together our own podcast, which is called The Show Where They Talk About Monsters. And that is not yet available on the website. We are going to launch that on October 31st on Halloween.
Perfect.
So we've done 8 episodes of that. So we'll be releasing them bi-weekly starting on October 31st. And then hopefully we're just going to keep doing them on into the future.
So is that going to be on like iTunes or just on our website?
Yeah, no, that'll definitely be available wherever you find podcasts, wherever fine podcasts are sold. It'll be there.
Thank you.
So I'm going to slip in my own question. COVID-19 has certainly disrupted the world, societies around, scared many people. Any signs you see of monsters evolving out of COVID-19 emerging?
There's no question that the zombie has adapted itself to fit our fear of pandemics. The zombie actually has its origins in the late 19th century in the slave revolts in Haiti. That's what a zombie used to be, was somebody who had become so beaten down by the act of enslavement that they had lost all of their ability to interact as humans, right? But those slaves, who everybody thought were beaten down to the point where they couldn't resist, actually rose up and kicked the French out of Haiti. So, and that phenomenon was so alarming to other people in the hemisphere, especially the US, that concept monsterized itself and started to infect itself into our culture in the 1930s. So, but the zombie has grown and transformed into many different things. It's definitely the fear of the alien infection of something from the outside of our society getting in and turning us all into swarms, mindless, soulless husks of what used to be people. And in the 1950s, of course, the fear was about communism. So you have all these Dawn of the Dead films and things like that, which are really, not that carefully masked fear of communism, but it's the outsider. They're going to turn us all into the same. We're all going to be, the same mindless horde moving forward. But in the 90s and the aughts, and especially more recently, the zombie takes on this characteristic. It's fast, right? Now it can solve problems. It's really a very insidious, very rapid creature now. But this is, I think, because of our rising fear of global pandemic. So the zombie fits perfectly into the whole concept of pandemic.
Now, I think I'm going to throw you a bit of a softball here. We have a question from Kirk. On the Santa Cruz campus, we do have our own, maybe a monster, maybe a golem, and you're connected with the theater department, right? When will we see Invasion of the Banana Slugs?
That is a bit of a softball. I tell you what, Kirk, if you write it, we'll produce it.
Thank you, Kirk.
Mark asks, Shakespeare's Caliban, an expression of the golem?
I don't think so. I don't think Caliban is an expression of the golem. Caliban is an expression of a different type of monster, the cannibal. And in fact, if you scramble the sounds in Caliban, you get cannibal or Caribbean, which is literally someone from the Caribbean is a cannibal. And so it had to do with the fear of exploring the new world, exploring India and the new continent, and what kind of monsters we would find out there. But it also is a very interesting displaced fear of the revenge of the indigenous peoples as we go out as colonizers, as we Europeans go out as colonizers. And of course, it's very important to talk about this today on Indigenous Peoples Day, as Mike pointed out earlier, that Caliban represents the enslaved other, right? He is a monster. There's no question that he's a monster, and he does monstrous things, but he is a slave. Unlike the other spirits on the island of the Tempest, the island of Skycarax, where Ferdinand the wizard holds his, Prospero the wizard holds his court. The other creatures are servants, but Caliban is a slave, and he has been subjugated, and he has no choice but to revolt however he can against Prospero's yoke. So I think Caliban represents a very different kind of monster for sure. But I love Caliban. As a matter of fact, it was the very first role that I ever played as an actor was Caliban, which may have started me down this path. I was in fourth grade.
In fourth grade in Shakespeare, amazing.
Fourth grade, we're doing Shakespeare in fourth grade, yeah.
Question from Annika. With this talk, both of gender and of medicine, as well as monsterization, I can't help but think about connections between the golem and the transgender person, being trans myself. Perceived artificially fear of an underlying physical strength for AMAB trans women, for example. Thoughts and further reading?
I couldn't agree more that is a very provocative line of thought, Annika. Thanks for that very much. I think that if you haven't already read Susan Stryker, Susan Stryker is one of the most important trans theorists working today. And Susan wrote Dr. Stryker, I should say, wrote an essay called, I want to get this right. I'm going to look it up really quickly because I want to make sure I get Chamonix. It's called My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage. And this is a wonderful, wonderful essay. If you haven't read it already, please read it right away. You can get a PDF of it on the internet. I think you should be able to find it without having to pay for anything. My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage. And this essay gets very deep into concepts of the constructed body, the artificial body, the tension between the artificial body and the natural body, in a way that I think you'll find very rewarding in terms of talking about these kinds of discourses of trans aesthetics. So I would recommend that one very, very highly.
I think I found that. I'll put it in the chat.
Great.
Iman has an interesting global comment. There are lots of monster lores outside Euro-America. We have a history PhD student working on Japanese monsters. And I'm interested in female monsters in Southeast Asia. Any comments?
Yes, absolutely. So one of my personal failures in the monster book, which I identified as I was writing it, was that it's all about Western monsters. It's all about Euro-American monsters. And I recognized that was a deficiency in my own work, and that I needed to expand beyond that. So right now I'm editing a group of essays called It's called Monsters in Performance, Essays on the Aesthetics of Disqualification. And I'm very happy to say that we've collected essays from all over the world about African monsters, South American monsters, and Southeast Asian monsters, specifically the Rangda, the Balinese sort of witch demon, which is very, very cool, very, very amazing monster. This is an essay that was written by Kathy Foley, who is emeritus faculty here at UCSC, one of the great Asianists of our day. And the Rangda is a really astonishing monster because she doesn't only embody evil, she embodies the balance between good and evil, between the mortal world and the divine world, between polarities that are not really opposites, but in fact, two parts of a component system. And that is central to Balinese spiritual culture. So this is a fascinating essay. I want to urge everybody to read this. I just turned it in to my editor, so it should be out in the next 6 months, maybe. Monsters in Performance, essays on the aesthetics of disqualification. Riva points out that another great author is representation on representation of the trans bodies, Finn Ericke and Jody Rosenberg. If you haven't seen that, Confessions of the Fox. Thank you, Riva. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you, Riva. Riva, we'll try to get your comments in here. This makes me wish we could make this a little more interactive, but we'll do our best here. Arlene asks, one second. Arlene asks, speaking of ethics, do any of the Golem stories deal with the creator's responsibility for the monster?
Yes, the more sophisticated ones do. The one that I talked about today, Leivik, thanks for your question, Arlene. The one that I talked about today by Leivik, the Maharal eventually becomes aware that he is the one responsible for the murders, that the Golem is not responsible for the murders that the Golem has committed, but in fact, the Maharal is responsible because he was the one who brought the Golem forth into the world to do violence on his behalf. So he thought he could skirt around this idea of ethics, and he couldn't. In the end, he couldn't. In the end, it was on him that falls the guilt. He says, "On my head falls the blood." But it's a real tragedy because here he is facing an existential threat to his community, and it seems to him that the only solution that he has is violence to prevent the violence and the genocide of his community. But that sort of violence is forbidden to us by our Menschlichkeit. So ethics becomes a tricky subject. You know, it can't just work for you when it's convenient. Thanks for that question.
Do you think politics drive shifts in identification of golems, or does social change play more of a role? Alternatively, could it be a rolling circle of chaotic interactions?
I'm going to go, Carol, with rolling circle of chaotic interactions. Yeah, I think that I have stopped looking for singular origins and emphases in monster studies, and instead I look for systems that interact, systems of representation, systems of teaching, systems of understanding, systems of othering, racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism. These are all discursive networks that link together, and politics and social change are imbricated. They're deeply, deeply connected with these systems. So I don't think you can touch one without the other. I think aesthetics is a result of politics and of social change, and I also think that it is an agent of politics and social change. So it really goes both ways. A chaotic circle of, what did you say? An endless chaotic circle. That's more apt, I think, as a description. Thank you, Carol.
Here's a quick question from Riva jumping in. Is Helen's book going to be performed at some point?
Wow.
Helen, yeah.
Helene Wecker's book, The Golem and the Genie. You know what I think, Riva, is that somebody should ask her if she would allow her work to be adapted into a stage performance, and then somebody might be willing to do that. So that's a conversation I think we should have. See if she's into that.
Stephanie asks another question about genre. She's wondering if Dr. Chambers can elaborate more on how focus on performance, which embodies and doesn't just reflect culture, specifically helps us unpack what's going on with the golem. What becomes visible through performance in contrast to other cultural representations of the golem?
What a great question, Stephanie. That goes to the heart of what we do as performance scholars. And this is a very important topic for us. And I barely touched on it when I was talking earlier. So full marks to you, gold star for spotting that. I really appreciate the question deeply. Here's how this works, I think, for monsters and for a lot of things besides monsters, but not just golems, but any monster, and also many different political concepts and issues. I think this is how this works. Something happens in reality that makes our society seem like it's not up to the task of coping with extant circumstances, right? There's some failure, some epistemic crisis of some sort that emerges in the culture. This causes a crisis, right, within the culture. We say, wait a minute, I thought our culture was perfect, and now I'm being confronted by the fact that it's not. And at that moment, I've got two options. I can either dig deep into that and gain a deep understanding of it and research it and really try and figure out where we've fallen wrong and really put in a lot of energy into fixing it. I could do that, but I'm actually not very likely to do that. Instead, I'm far more likely to try and find some way to whitewash over it and pretend that it never happened, right? And one of the easiest ways of doing that is to blame somebody, right? Hopefully not me, but somebody else, some other person. Now, how do I identify who that other is? It doesn't really matter. I'll take anybody, right? Anybody who I can slap this image of a monster on top of, right? But the problem is that's not real. That's not a real solution to the problem, you know? When they started burning witches, they just found more witches, right? They just kept finding more and more witches. It wasn't solving any of the problems. Like somebody's cattle are dying, they get the plague and they die, or the plague is the bubonic plague is ravaging a city, and they find a witch and burn her, or they find a Jew and hang him because they think he's poisoning the wells, and it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop the problem, right? So at that moment, you could say, "Wow, wait a minute. Maybe that we were all wrong in the course of this madness that we got into. We should stop." But we're not likely to do that. Instead, we're much more likely to repeat the lies that we're attempting to whitewash over this. And in that process of repetition, embodiment becomes very, very powerful, right? It's not just enough to sort of tell the story. Again, we need to enact it in real life. So we enact it in theater, in performance, and then our brains sort of say, well, this isn't fake. This is actually happening in real life. This is, to some extent, this is actually real. And it is to some extent real. So the process of embodiment really drives home this this cycle of substitution. So I'm sorry, I kind of got into the weeds on that one, but that's one of my favorite topics to discuss. So that's just a sort of a scratching the surface of why embodiment is so important as a concept of performance theorists. So thank you so much for your question, Stephanie.
Question from Alyssa. And I just wanted to ask the audience, like, keep these questions coming. It's a really remarkable conversation. So if you have some questions, type them in the Q&A box. Wouldn't changing, from Alyssa, wouldn't changing the gender in the 1920s version just add an LGBTQ plus discourse to these productions?
Changing the gender? Yes, it absolutely would. Absolutely. And I would love to see a production of the Golem done now in which the golem was non-binary or transgendered in some way. I would love to see that. I think it would open up a lot of new, really interesting discourses for us to engage with. I think it's a great idea. I think you should write that play, Alyssa. I would love to see you write that play.
So Janet wonders about the relationship between Donald Trump and a golem. In your view, is Donald Trump a golem or the creator of a golem? Or does it depend on the viewpoint of the perceiver?
Well, that is a really interesting question, Janet. I believe that monsters have purely cultural bodies, that they don't exist. They are real in that they have real effects on real people. They, you know, a representation of a golem in a play is real, but the golem doesn't exist. So when we are talking about human beings who do evil or who behave in a monstrous way, we have to really avoid the temptation of calling them monsters. Instead, we have to take on, from an ethical perspective, the fact that they are humans born of human parents, and that therefore what they are doing is not alien to the experience of being human. I know this is really, really hard, but to find compassion for those who are your enemies, especially if those enemies have no compassion for you, that's the mandate of Menschlichkeit, you know, if we believe in that. I know it's a very high-minded position to take, and it's super easy for me to say that sitting here in my office here at UCSC and just say like, oh no, Trump's not a monster. Because we are surrounded by people who behave monstrously and do monstrous things. There's no denying that. But I think that we need to think, when we think about the difference between humans and monsters, is that humans exist, right? And monsters don't.
Marvelous answer. Question from Mark. Another monster perhaps associated with pandemics is Nosferatu, the vampire.
Yeah. Yeah, is that it?
Yes, comment, question?
Yeah, Nosferatu was a rather faithful adaptation of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker that was directed by F.W. Murnau in 1922, I want to say. I think 1922. Wonderful film in which Nosferatu appears very much like a rat or a bat, you know, some vermin that is a carrier of disease. And unfortunately, that image was also taken up by anti-Semites in Germany, and they said, see, this is the vampire as the Jew, or the Jew as the vampire, and this is just another example of how the Jew spreads contagion within the community, right? I don't know that F.W. Murnau meant it that way. I'm sure he didn't give back any of the money that he made, but I don't know that he specifically meant it like that. I think he did mean it to create the idea of the vampire as the vector for disease. I do think that that is absolutely what he had in mind. It's a great film, by the way. Everybody should see Nosferatu.
So Andy asks, and this is not a softball question, what are your thoughts on the connection or distancing of military drones and military drone operators?
I would say that this is a perfect example of what we talk about Menschlichkeit, right? Because the drone could definitely be a golem, right? Could definitely be a metaphor for a golem, or the golem is a metaphor for a drone, is more specifically to say that. An agent of us that goes out and does the dirty work, and we can stay home and keep our hands clean, right? And of course, what Leivik's play teaches us is that that is not possible, right? If you are committing violence, even if you're doing it through a proxy, you are still guilty of that violence, right? And more specifically, it's not about celestial punishment. It's not about whether you go to heaven or hell. It's about the effect that it has on your experience as a human. It's about what happens to people who do violent things. They become twisted and dark, and they live in pain. That's the whole point. It's not about God punishing you or rewarding you. You know, in Jewish spiritualism, God doesn't do that, right? So it's about how you have to live with yourself after what you've done. So I would say that when we're talking about this phenomenon that I've read about, where drone operators become distanced from the work that they're doing as as killers, and they think, oh no, I'm just playing a video game, or they can tell themselves that. I think that probably only lasts for a little while, and then that will come home sooner or later.
Well, I'm gonna combine a couple of comments here that are related, I think. Just related to the previous question about the LGBTQ plus Golem. Kevin Karplus comments, perhaps the rabbi should be female also. And Annika comments, well, now with changing the Golem's gender in mind, there's also the Lilith midrash, since Eve was created from Adam's rib, but Lilith was also created of earth.
Absolutely, that's a really well. There's a lot there. I think Kevin and Annika and Elisa, I think maybe this concept of an LGBTQ golem, I think is gaining a lot of traction here. I think we should probably meet and talk about the creation of an LGBTQ golem story that we could tell. If any of you are students or no students, this would be a really great idea for the Monsters competition, the writing competition that we're going to do in May. But I'm into it. Let's do it. I think it's great. Let's get some big minds thinking on this, and let's put something together. Yeah. What was the other part of that?
I think, it's been dismissed here. Give me a second. Something about Lilith and
Lilith.
Eve's being created from the rib of Adam, but also the earth, I think.
Lilith is another Jewish folktale from about the 8th century. This comes from about the same time. That Lilith was God's first attempt at creating a bride for Adam, and she was made out of the earth like he was, or out of slime and salt or something like that. And she notoriously, according to the stories, she refused to take the submissive position during sex. And rather than be subjected to Adam's will, she was perfectly willing to kill him instead of being subjected to his will. So she was sent to wander along the shores of the Red Sea, where she was paid court to by the demons of earth and air. And she created a whole race of monsters called the Lilim, who operate just outside our field of vision. They're just like right beyond the periphery of our vision. That's where they live. And they hate us. They absolutely hate us. Because they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden too, and they didn't do anything wrong. See? So Lilith was an anti-feminist symbol of the perfidy of women for a long time. But then in the 80s and 90s, Lilith was reclaimed as a feminist icon. And it's a really interesting story. Lilith as a monster is a super interesting character.
So this may have to be the last, it's a comment, deserving of your comment from Riva again. When I wrote my version of the tale in my memoir, I didn't give the golem a gender, but that was to raise the question of what the rabbi understood of the body he was creating. That he was, in the moment, perhaps so overwhelmed by the act of godlike creation that he paid no attention to the responsibilities of making a body.
That's very powerful, very moving. Riva, thank you so much.
Maybe one last question from Samuel. Isn't change itself the greatest monster? Oh, I'm sorry, did you have more comments?
No.
Okay. Isn't change itself the greatest monster? What is more frightening than the future when it is completely out of our control?
I'm so glad, Samuel, that you brought that up, because my students write that they are desperately trying to envision a future that contains them, that is also a good future. And for those of us who were born, like I was born in 1970, and we had started to distrust authority. It was after the culture, the changes in the culture, the counterculture had emerged in the 70s. And we just didn't trust authority, but we didn't think that the world was coming to an end. My students who are 18, 19, 20, 21, they do think the world is coming to an end. And the reason is because they can see that it is. Or at least it appears to be. They are therefore extremely interested in monsters. The monsters that populate this kind of place, this kind of a eschatological environment. And so nobody's coming up to me going, why are you studying monsters anymore? You know, people are like, talk about the monster that scares me, right? That because we're scared, and we have every right to be scared. It's a scary time, right? I'm coming to you from the bunker of my office because we can't get together, right? We can't come together because of the disease, of the contagion that we might spread to one another. So yeah, I don't want to end it on such a down note, but my students are looking around for ways that they can fix things, and monsters actually provide a way of envisioning a better future. And I think that's what the Golem does in Leivik's play. That the Golem, for all of the horror that the Golem and the Maharal have to go through, that the Rabbi and the Golem have to go through, there is ultimately a better future envisioned for us. And I deeply believe in the power of monsters to do that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm never going to look at monsters the same way again. A big round of applause, please, in the Q&A box for our Professor Chemers. Thank you for sharing your fascinating insights with us. A note again, the talk has been recorded and it will be available in UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel in a few days. Also, a big round of thanks, please, to the staff of the alumni and university events offices who set this online forum up. Thank you, Shana, Diana, Paulina, and Kristen. Now, our next event is on Monday, November 8th, and we'll stay in the arts, specifically filmmaking. The Academy Award nominated, Emmy Award winning filmmaker, Professor D. Hibbert Jones, will speak on art, animation, and politics, creative practice as a political act. Her work in art and documentary films examine power and politics. Who gets heard? She explores diverse subjects from land use and wasted resources to criminal justice and indigent rights, examining what is considered valuable and who is dismissed as valueless. Now, the big event I want you to remember for this round is on November 3rd, Giving Day for the campus community. Giving Day is a 24-hour online fundraising drive to support UC Santa Cruz students and faculty programs. Hundreds of creative, valuable teams present their plans, and you're bound to find one or more that mesh with your passions. As part of this day, the Alumni Council will be raising funds for its Alumni Association Scholarship Fund, a need-based scholarship designed to alleviate high current tuition costs for well-deserving, but still an inadequate number of students. This scholarship is unique because students will continue to receive the aid each year they are enrolled, providing financial relief on a continual basis through the life of the students. Now, Alumni Council itself participates in the selection of each recipient. Remember, though, you can also support the Center for Monster Studies by donating to the UCSC Humanities Institute and specifying in a note that it's for monster studies. I think we'll be getting a link in the chat box for that. If not, it'll certainly be coming in the emails for you. Okay, you'll be receiving emails in coming weeks with regard to that, as well as the Giving Day in general. Please scan the myriad of student initiatives that will be available. And on Giving Day, November 3rd, go to givingday.ucsc.edu. Well, thank you in advance for your support. So on behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association, thank you for joining us. And please come back on November 8th, 6:30 p.m. for our next virtual event.